everyone, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today I'm taking you on an adventure on how I made Eowyn's green velvet dress. To start off, I had to choose whether I was going to draft my pattern or use a base pattern, and I went with using Simplicity's 4940 pattern to use as a base, since I already had that in my stash. I rolled out my pattern paper to trace over the original pattern paper. I don't like to cut into my actual patterns. I like to keep them just in case I change in size, because that has happened in the past. So I rolled out my pattern paper and traced over it onto a new set of paper and made sure to label everything appropriately. So once I had my full pieces drawn out, I then traced out the upper portion of each of the dress pieces so that I could get a bodice piece. Because Eowyn has a dropped waist, I wanted to have just the top part and a little bit of the skirt past the hips so that I could figure out where I wanted that dropped waist to be with my mock-up. Once I had all of my muslin pieces cut out, then I started sewing together my mock-up. And I knew that I was going to make modifications to the yoke as well, because in the pattern it didn't sit as I wanted it to. So that was something that I was going to have to adjust for in the mock-up as well. And you can see here that I have actually put the mock-up on. I'm actually looking at myself in the mirror and tracing out where my new seam lines are going to be with pencil on my actual muslin fabric. Once I was satisfied with the new seam lines, I went ahead and cut out my pattern along those seam lines and then proceeded to go ahead and redraw those on paper, adding, of course, my seam allowance that I no longer have. So once I knew where the waist was going to be for the dress, I also knew where the waist was going to be for the skirt. So the skirt is a separate piece of the actual dress so that it gives that illusion that there is an underdress underneath without actually having all of the layers. I modified the dress pattern so that I had the skirt resting at the waistline. Then it came time to actually cutting out my pattern pieces, and I actually had to pattern match for this because of the pattern on the actual skirt. That was pretty difficult because my seams are not straight up and down the grain, but rather at an angle because of the princess seam. So yeah, there was a bit of a struggle to get the patterns to match properly. And then once I sewed them all together, I finished up all the edges with the serger to make sure that they were nice and clean on the inside.
All right, so I'm working on my Eowyn skirt, and because I have a limited amount of this particular fabric, I decided to basically make the underskirt with the bare minimum of fabric, which basically is like, I want it to be at the same waistline as the dress, where the waistline will be. But that waistline is gonna be at my hips, right? So it's gonna be hip level. So in order for this to fit comfortably on me, I want to add an extra layer, a yoke, if you will, to the top of the skirt with a different fabric, so that way I can actually have like a waistband, and that way I don't have to worry about the skirt falling off my hips, because frankly, this skirt will fall off my hips the way it is right now. So basically what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna do a probably half circle yoke. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna measure the length of the hip right now. And that will be my guide for the outer circumference. And then from there, I will figure out how to make my yoke, essentially. If that doesn't work, because I will do just like a quick test with like some scrap fabric, just base it on and just test it out to see if it works. If it doesn't work, then I'll just do a long rectangle in this length, and then I'll just gather that into the waistband. Yeah, so we'll see how it goes.
So when it comes to measuring the waistband, you want to make sure that you really hold the measuring tape firmly, because if you let it slip a little bit, it can ruin your measurements completely. I ended up going with the rectangular yoke for this because the circle just didn't work out for me as I intended to. And also I had limited fabric with the fabric that I was going to use, because that was the only color that really worked with the fabric that I had. So I sewed the bottom of the rectangle to the waist of the skirt, and because this was a rectangle, that means that the waist part of the skirt was going to be the same width as my hips. So I went ahead and gathered the top edge so that it would fit into the waistband of the actual garment. And then I went ahead and sewed the waistband. Now I didn't have enough of the green fabric to actually finish the waistband with both sides of the green, so I ended up using a white poplin as my lining of the waistband. This is very much me taking scrap materials from my stash and putting it together to make this skirt. Once the waistband was on, I put on the skirt to make sure that it was the right length and that it fit well, and I was pretty happy with it, not gonna lie. Finally, it came time to inserting a zipper. So once again, I was using a scrap zipper that I had harvested from an older costume to use for the skirt here. I had to measure out how long my skirt was and make sure to cut off the end of the zipper so that it was the right length. So for the skirt, I didn't really care so much if it was an invisible zipper, so I just sewed a centered zipper because that was just the easiest thing for me to do with this. Since the skirt itself was going to be hidden by the dress, I didn't really care if there was a zipper that would be more visible than an invisible zipper. Once the zipper was in, then I had to hand sew the waistband closed. So I had to put the lining and sew it to the seam allowance of the waistband itself so that it wouldn't show through to the other side of the skirt, right? Even though the waistband was going to be hidden underneath the dress, I still wanted it to be clean, so I didn't want to have any stitches showing through. The last thing to do was to hem the skirt itself. So I sewed in a very wide stitch at the bottom to act as a guide for when I would fold over the hem line. I then attempted to gather this edge a little bit. Because it is a circle skirt, the outer edge is always going to be a little bit wider than the inner edge when you're folding over for the hem. So I tried to gather it a little bit to kind of take in some of that bulk. Once it was a little bit gathered, I brought it to my serger so that I could get a nice clean edge all the way around the bottom of the skirt. I was only going to fold over once because I had a limited amount of material and I didn't want to make it too short because it was already short enough as it was. Then I went to my ironing board and I made sure to painstakingly fold over the edge and press it down before I went back to the machine to sew that last stitch line in place for the hem. So then it came time to working on the actual dress. So I was a little bit nervous about this because I was using velvet that was relatively expensive. I did get it for a much more affordable price. I got it on sale, but you know, cutting into your good fabric is always nerve-wracking. So I started off by working on the skirt for the front panel. So the front panel is going to be a panel that is completely separate from the rest of the skirt and can pull up to reveal the underskirt. And so it would be lined with the same fabric as the underskirt. So I went ahead and started putting together the front panel lining using that material, and then went ahead and did the same with the green velvet. Now, I had to learn how to iron seams with velvet material. Because velvet has a pile, I didn't want to crush it. So I put some scrap velvet on my ironing board, laid it up, and then put my seam down and gently used the steam on my seam to kind of like heat up the velvet, and then I finger pressed it open to press the seam. I had to be very careful with this because steam is very hot and you can burn yourself. Now, this green velvet is stretch velvet, which meant that I eventually had to go back to all of the edges where it would be attaching to non-stretch material and stay stitch those edges to prevent it from stretching. Then it came time to putting together the lining and the fashion fabric of the front panel. Once they were all pinned together, I noticed that the hemline was not matching up, but I wasn't really concerned about that. I knew that the fabric for the green velvet would stretch because it is a stretch fabric. So I went ahead and sewed together the sides of this garment, and I tried to make sure not to pull on the fabric itself. I then hand basted the two bottom edges of the skirt flap together and then machine sewed that so that it was going to be nice and sturdy. And then I went to go to the serger to basically finish off that bottom hem and cut off any excess before I would flip it inside out and prep it for, you know, the skirt flap itself. When it came time to making the rest of the skirt, sewing it together was pretty simple. I just had to hem the sides and make sure to have the seams all serged and finished so that they wouldn't fray and it would all look nice and clean on the inside of the skirt. Then it was time to sew up the bodice. So sewing up the bodice was relatively straightforward. Again, it was just similar to the mock-up itself. I used a black poplin for the lining of the bodice, again because I was trying to use scrap fabric that I had lying around the house. When it came time to sewing the yoke, this is where I had to pay attention to the pattern itself and the directions because I had modified how the collar was, and so I had to kind of like pay attention to what I was doing because the pattern was a little funky. So I sewed up the side seams, or the shoulder seams I should say, of the yoke before I then sewed the top all along the top edge so that I could have that nice clean turn over for the collar essentially. Once I was done, then I basted the lining and the front pieces together at the very bottom of the yoke itself so that it would stay together when I sewed it onto the dress. Now this is where I had to be careful not to pull and stretch on the green velvet because otherwise it would be really funky on my yoke. Once the yoke was in place, I then basted the lining to the fashion fabric all around the armholes so that I could have a solid piece essentially when assembling the dress. I took it to my serger and cleaned up that inner edge around the armhole, making it nice and smooth and even. And of course, I had to do an obligatory try on, and I was really happy with how it was all turning out. Then it came time to attaching the skirt flap to the bodice. So I hand sewed this down first because I wanted to make sure that I had a lot of control with where the skirt flap was gonna be. And the same thing for the actual skirt parts. So I had to sew the skirt parts on after because I wanted there to be a layering effect so that the skirt flap would basically go over the edge of the rest of the skirt. And once those were all hand basted together, then that's when I took it to the sewing machine to sew the bodice and the skirt pieces together. Now, for the sleeve lining, I actually didn't have enough of the fabric that I wanted to use, so I had to piece it together so that the outer edge of the lining was going to be the fabric I wanted, and then the inner part of the fabric was black poplin. Not my preferred choice, but it is what it is. Now, Eowyn has an undersleeve that has lace up along the forearm, essentially. So I went ahead and drew out some darts on my lower sleeve portion and marked off where I was going to be sewing in those loops. I sewed those loops in using some of the cord that I had lying around. I had to hand sew the little loops together because how else was I going to do this? So I hand sewed them together and had to be very careful because as soon as I cut the fabric, it would start fraying immediately. So I had to be very careful about leaving some excess so that I would have room to work with before it frayed to all hell. And once they were all sewn together, that's when I hand stitched them to the right side of the bodice so that the ends of it would be stuck in the dart. Once all those loops were in place, I very carefully sewed the darts on each side of the forearm, and I had to do this in parts because once I got to the loop part, that's where it became very difficult to go under my machine, so I had to kind of do this in parts. And then it just came time to sewing up the sleeve seam, And of course I wanted it to be nice and clean, so I then brought it over to the serger to clean up those edges. Then I hemmed the hem of the sleeve. This was pretty tricky to do because it was a pretty small circumference. So it'd take a lot of finicky and playing around with the machine. Once that inner sleeve was sewn, I then sewed it to the lining of the sleeve so that it would be ready to go with the rest of the sleeve. For the upper sleeve, I had to gather the edges a little bit at the top so that it would fit nicely into my armhole. I then sewed up the remainder of the fashion fabric for the sleeve and then sewed that to the lining along the hem. Now, I had to baste the hem of the sleeves together first because once again, I was working with stretch fabric and I had to make sure that it wouldn't move around too much because pinning can only do so much. Then it came time to trimming and cutting out my excess around the curves, so I cut out notches so that it would fold nicely when it would be flipped right side out. So once I managed to flip the right side out of the sleeve, I was able to then connect the sleeve right at the elbow and sew that part together so that it would be ready to be attached to the upper part of the sleeve. While I didn't film me sewing the sleeve in, once the sleeve was in, that's when it was time to add the details. So this is where I did a lot of hand sewing. I hand sewed the trim to the collar and to the edge of the yoke because I had much more control over it in this regard. I also hand sewed the gold cording that went around the trim. For this one, I used a whip stitch type stitch because I didn't really know how else to fix the cord to the fabric. So I would try to go up through the cord and then around again. Finally, it came time to sew in the zipper. For the dress zipper, I did use an invisible zipper, and I did go with a green to match the dark green velvet rather than the yoke part because the yoke was much smaller in terms of length. Then, of course, I took these skirt pieces and I basically finished them with the serger before I hemmed the entire bottom of the skirt, doing that once over roll hem like I did with the underskirt. Then it came time to doing some final touches like sewing on some cord so that I could pull up the front flap like Eowyn has in the actual movies. So I had to sew one cord to my right side seam, and then I found a spot along the left part of the skirt flap to sew the other cord so that I could nicely pull up that skirt flap and drape it so that it would reveal the underskirt like that. And there you have it. That is how I made my Eowyn dress. Is it perfect? No. Am I happy with it? Hell yeah. This has been a dream cosplay of mine for so long, and I finally felt confident enough to pull it off. If you like this type of content, don't forget to give me a like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye for now.